Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture in Psychology 4440. In this lecture, we'll talk about the history of drug use and drugs. So this is our second lecture. We're not going to hone in on any particular drug. As you'll see, we'll cover a variety of them. And this is really for the purpose of putting our current attitudes toward drugs and drug use in historical perspective. So as we'll see, our attitudes now don't necessarily match those of other cultures and even our culture throughout history. Certainly ancient history, the approach to drugs was very different, as we'll see. So we'll talk a little bit about that ancient history and even recent history up until about the turn of the 20th century. Uh, so we will begin. So just an overview of today's topic. We'll look at the history of drugs, and drugs have affected human development in a number of ways, in ways that we don't often think about in our current society, for reasons we'll get into soon. Drugs have had a religious purpose for many religions in many cultures and throughout history, and continue to do so. But they also have an economic impact, and today we think of drugs and drug use in the United States um, as having this very definite separation between legal drugs and illegal drugs, and a large portion of the illegal drugs uh, are from other countries, right? They're imported to our or exported to our country, we might think of these drugs as being economically useful to a drug cartel, um, but because they're outside the legal system, we don't generally think of the economics of the drug trade, except as it pertains to our pharmaceutical industry, which is massive, to be sure. But we'll talk about the economics of more common drugs and drugs that are more likely to be abused historically. They've actually had an impact on our political system as well, and the political system throughout history. So not just in terms of drug regulation, but the actual course of nations. And of course, drugs' more recent role purely as medicine uh, that's been developing for centuries and millennia. And so we'll talk about how that process has evolved, how our attitudes toward drugs and thinking of them as medicines and that being their primary purpose uh, has come out of history and how that has changed over even pretty recent history. So again, when we get to individual drugs as the weeks of the course progress, we'll cover the recent history of each drug, a little bit of the ancient history just to go over it again. But this is really the lecture where we'll talk about the broad scope of impact that drugs have had. So in this session, what we're going to do is learn how other cultures have approached drug use, how they encouraged or discouraged drug use. What are the properties of those cultures? And look at how these drugs have affected not just the behavior of the individual, we'll get to that as we cover the individual drugs, but as a society. So certain practices, as I mentioned, religious practices in particular early on, uh, revolved or at least involved drug use, certain kinds of drugs. But societies that benefited from the manufacture, export, sale of certain drugs have had their history altered forever by the presence of those drugs. And we'll use this to really gain some perspective on our current society's attitude toward drug use. And again, this is not to claim that everyone in our society views drugs and drug use the same way. We talked last time about how even over the last 40 years, our social attitudes have changed and affected the prevalence of drug use among adolescents in particular. But by looking at the different roles drugs have had throughout history and the different ways that cultures have approached them, we'll understand a little bit better how our society came to view drugs the way that it does, and also come to understand that our current view of looking at drugs is not necessarily right or wrong. Again, we don't want to put moral connotations on our judgments here, but just that it's different, and there's a wide variety of perspectives on drug use um, that have changed over centuries and millennia. So that's what this session is really about. So currently, we can think about drug regulations in the United States, and we'll actually devote an entire week to this topic here after we look at the brain and drugs' effects on the brain. So there are obviously a variety of regulations, but in their essence, uh, regulations often delineate between legal and illegal or illicit substances. Um, So this, this distinction between legal and illegal is not always based on the benefit or harm of the substance, although those those tend to go hand in hand. Often there's some history to whether a substance is legal or illegal, and these things change. We also have uh, regulatory bodies like the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, that evaluate whether a drug is safe to use, what its side effects are, whether it's proper to use it for this condition or that condition. So we have this regulatory body that is part of the government, part of the federal government, that evaluates things scientifically. As we'll see, that's a very new phenomenon. Um, that has not always been the case, just because our scientific knowledge and our governments weren't capable of that level of evaluation. And of course, for the last couple of decades, we've had in the U.S. what we call the war on drugs. And how well that war has gone or how properly conceived it was is a matter for debate. But the idea, the reason I bring it up here, is that it's very reflective of our attitude currently toward drug use. That we think of drugs as a sort of external force and even an adversarial force. Whereas, as we'll see, many cultures and societies, drugs have come from within. That the uh, drug users were very much part of society. They were not relegated to the outskirts of society, as they often are now. That sometimes drugs were a critical part of the society's religious life or their economic life. And so the fact that we're currently engaged in this war on drugs um, really helps frame our attitude toward drugs and drug use. And there are currently a number of influences on our attitudes toward drugs and drug use. For example, we have scientific knowledge now about what drugs do, about how they work, about their long-term benefits or harmful consequences. And that wasn't available to ancient peoples and even fairly recent people, just because they didn't have a scientific framework for evaluating drugs. And so that evaluation process is again, relatively new. And so we can look at drugs' effects on the individual, but also try to understand their effects on society. And we can enact laws that regulate drugs or set up bodies that evaluate drugs like the FDA. And these are new possibilities. And of course, we now have medical professionals. So we have a group of people in our society that are trained and licensed to recommend drugs or to distribute drugs. We have pharmacists, we have doctors. And so these are all people that have specialized training and that are liable for the consequences if a drug is misprescribed or if they recommend the wrong drug in general. And of course, this is relatively new also. Um, there have always been medical professionals in one capacity or another, whether they went by the name doctor or not. But the fact is that not much was known about the science behind drugs, that a lot of this process was through trial and error, and that also there were not laws in place that made distributing dangerous drugs or improperly distributing drugs illegal, that they were just viewed as businessmen, and so that there was no punishment for giving a harmful substance to other people. Okay, so one of the earliest uses of psychoactive drugs was in the context of religious ceremonies. And usually these were what we call hallucinogens. And hallucinogens we'll talk more about toward the end of the course, so we'll have a whole week on hallucinogens. But what these do is these alter perception. Technically speaking, they don't really foster hallucinations in general. More often than not, they just alter our visual perception. They are usually visually effective. Um, but they're called hallucinogens, and so that's just the name we use. And so in particular, they drugs that are used in religious ceremonies are usually called entheogens. And so this just means a drug that's used for a religious or a spiritual purpose. And so if you look at this word, you see the word theo, which is the same root that we have in the word theology. And so what an entheogen is literally, it's one that creates the divine within us. Uh, as a more practical matter, it just means a drug that is used religiously or spiritually as part of a ceremony to foster some sort of spiritual experience. And these include things like peyote, which were traditionally used by Native American groups. The primary drug in peyote is called mescaline, and again, we'll get to that when we talk about hallucinogens. You also have mushrooms containing psilocybin. These are also called magic mushrooms, but it's a particular species of mushroom that again fosters a psychedelic or hallucinogenic experience. In South America, you have ayahuasca, and this is less well known. Everyone's probably heard of peyote and almost certainly heard of mushrooms. But there are other hallucinogenic drugs that were used by native groups in their religious practices. Of course, cannabis or marijuana has been used by a variety of groups. In high enough doses, cannabis can generate visual hallucinations, and even tobacco, if again ingested or smoked in sufficient quantity, can produce hallucinatory effects. And tobacco, we'll talk about here in a few slides, but has primarily been used by Native American groups in their religious and social practices. Of course, this brings up the issue of a possible tension between drug regulation and religious practice. Many of these drugs are or have been illegal or clearly have harmful effects if consumed in insufficient quantity. And so one of the questions, in fact, this will be a discussion question this week, is how do we make the decision between using regulations to protect society from the harmful effects of certain drugs, and how do we weigh that between the harmful effects and the right to religious practice? If these drugs are part of religious ceremonies, where do we draw the line? How do we make that distinction, and what do we do about that? So that'll be a discussion question for this week. And by the way, I should mention that religiously used drugs are not limited to hallucinogens. Certainly, Christianity and certainly other religions as well use wine as a part of their religious ceremonies. Now, not in terms of its psychoactive properties necessarily, but as part of the ceremony. Wine is an important component. And so we have the presence of alcohol in a religious ceremony. Now, of course, religions aren't always thought of as promoting drug use. Some religious groups prohibit drug use, and in very particular drugs. So, for example, Islam prohibits the use of alcohol. Now, that one has been true throughout the history of Islam. Islam's relationship with cannabis is a little more complex. It has at times been allowed or encouraged, and at other times discouraged or banned, particularly in the form of hashish, which is shown here in the picture on the right. So there are various forms of cannabis, and whether it's been allowed or not is varied throughout Islamic history. It has a history of medicinal use, uh, but its recreational use has been uh, discouraged or banned or allowed, depending on the time period and the region. And of course, the Mormon Church has prohibitions against alcohol and caffeine. So this comes from religious texts, and that's one of the issues with drugs and religion, especially when it comes to prohibiting drugs, is that religious texts, especially older ones, can't anticipate all the drugs that have been discovered or developed. And so it's interesting to see how religions deal with drugs as they are discovered. Are they allowed? Are they not? If they're not mentioned specifically. Um, for example, in the Mormon religion, dealing with caffeine, the technically speaking, the prohibition is against hot drinks, which is uh, which has been cited as prohibiting coffee and tea. But what about soda? Of course, caffeinated soda didn't exist when those religious texts were written. So then religious groups have to deal with new technologies, with new drugs. Um, and so there is still debate, as I understand it, in the Mormon church as to whether soda with caffeine in it is allowed or not. Okay, so that's drugs in religious life, but drugs are also an economic force. So we say there's a market for drugs, and I don't mean a physical market in this case. What I mean is an economic opportunity. So one of the things that fosters drugs as an economic force in human society is limited supply. We've all heard of the term of the phrase supply and demand. And so if the supply is limited, that means that a drug can be valuable. If everyone has it, it's not very valuable. You can't charge for it if everyone's got it. But if the supply is limited, either because not everyone has the technical skill to produce it, or because the drug can only be produced in a certain region, well, now you've created a group of people that have the drug and a group of people that don't. And so now the people that have it can impose a price. And so they can make money um, or they can trade for the drug if they have it. And so this map here on the right just shows you the distribution network for a couple of drugs, cocaine and uh, opiates, which come from the opiate poppy. So opiates, the opium poppy really just grows primarily in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. And so this is where the drug can be grown, and people who grow it can then sell it and move it, export it across the world. And similarly, uh, coca, the plant from which cocaine is derived, can be grown in Central and South America. So we are all aware of the phenomenon of South American drug cartels that export cocaine to the United States, and that's how they make their money. Drugs also tend to be non-perishable. So if it's a natural product like cannabis or mushrooms, they can be dried and then moved wherever. If it's something like cocaine, it can be purified and then shipped in that pure form, and it doesn't really go bad. Similarly, alcohol, of course, is its own preservative. It's a disinfectant, which means it kills microbes, so it doesn't spoil very easily either. So that means it can survive being exported all over the world. Drugs, of course, are also consumable goods. As people consume them, they run out, so they need more. If it was the case that you could just buy drugs once and then live off them for the rest of your life, that wouldn't be a very good basis for an economy. So the fact that people require, the fact that drugs require replenishing contributes to its power as an economic good. And of course, depending on the drug, if you give someone a drug and that person becomes dependent on it, then they not only increase the frequency of their use, they're willing to expend more of their money or resources to get the drug. So in that sense, a drug that encourages drug dependence kind of creates its own demand. So we talked about having limited supply, only a handful of people can produce the drug, and now you've got a demand that can actually increase over time as people become more and more dependent on it. So these are the sort of basic factors that make drugs such a powerful economic agent. And now we'll talk about certain drugs in particular. So, for example, alcohol, as we saw last time, was the most popular drug of choice for us in the U.S. And again, alcohol here means ethyl alcohol or ethanol, drinking alcohol. Um, and alcohol is derived from the process of fermentation, which is a natural process by which yeast turns sugar into ethanol. So they consume the sugar and excrete the ethanol as a byproduct. But yeasts are just organisms. They're naturally occurring. And so this was discovered fairly early on. In fact, fruit, for example, will ferment without any human intervention whatsoever. So the process of fermentation was discovered probably around 10,000 years ago. So that's how long people have been making alcoholic beverages. And this can be turned in, alcoholic beverages can be in the form primarily of beer or wine or distilled spirits, otherwise known as liquor. Uh, so distilled spirits require an extra step. You have a fermented product and then they have to be further distilled. That is, you concentrate the alcohol and some of the flavors into liquor. So for example, on the right here, we have a map of an early Mediterranean civilization called the Phoenicians. And they figured out how to make wine. And so then they traded it all over the Mediterranean for things they needed and for currency, for precious metals, because they knew how to make wine, and they were in a good wine growing area, and other people around the Mediterranean didn't. So they were willing to pay for wine. So the alcohol drug, the drug alcohol became this economic medium, this economic good. And alcohol, as I mentioned, is also common in religious practices, not necessarily in order to induce a spiritual experience, but it's still incorporated in a variety of religious ceremonies. And so this has been going on for thousands of years. But alcohol, because only a certain number of people know how to produce it, to ferment it, distill it, and it only grows in certain regions. If you're making alcoholic beverages from grapes, if you're making wine, grapes only grow in certain areas. If you're making it from grain, you need to be able to farm grain, which isn't true everywhere. So alcoholic beverages, in addition to having economic value because of their properties, have some other advantages as well. As we mentioned last time, alcohol sort of counts as both a drug and a food. Alcoholic beverages have nutritional value. The alcohol itself has caloric content, but because alcoholic beverages are derived from things like grapes, grain, they also carry with them sugars, other nutrients, vitamins, and so there is actual nutritional content to alcoholic beverages, unlike something like cocaine, which can't nourish the body at all. They also tend to be easy to transport. So you can take a ton of grapes and concentrate it down to a relatively small volume of wine. So it's much easier to transport the wine than it is the grapes the wine originally came from. Because alcohol is also an antimicrobial agent, these goods are also less perishable. So grapes themselves won't last that long if you just leave them out. But a bottle of wine will last for decades if it's properly sealed. So these properties came into play for things like the building of the pyramids in ancient Egypt. So the ancient Egyptians brewed a beverage not dissimilar from beer. It was basically flat beer. Uh, and it had a very low alcohol content. I'm not going to imply that the pyramids were built by a bunch of drunk people, but the fact is that beer is sort of, in many ways, liquid bread. It doesn't spoil very easily. It's pretty easy to move around. And so the ancient Egyptians used beer to nourish the workers that worked in the pyramids. But of course, it has its downside as an economic good as well. In American history, there is what's called the Whiskey Rebellion, where in the western portion of the early colonies, uh, whiskey was actually used as a medium of exchange. That is to say, used like money. Again, it keeps for a long time. It has inherent value, and people would trade it back and forth as though it were money. And then the federal government, which was very new, uh, decided to put a tax on whiskey, which naturally a lot of the colonists thought was unfair, and so they rebelled against the tax because they were being taxed for their representation. And this was very early in the history of our country, uh, but it represents how powerful an economic agent alcoholic beverages can be. The tax was repealed fairly quickly, uh, but still, we can see how alcoholic beverages uh, are useful in an economic context. Then there's tobacco, another common drug. This is a plant, of course, that's native to the Americas. So there was no history of tobacco in Europe and Eurasia and Africa. Um, and it was a very important export for the colonies once countries like Great Britain founded colonies here in what would become the United States. So the colonists would grow things like tobacco and cotton and sugar, export them to Europe, and then Europe, of course, had its industries that could convert raw products into manufactured goods, and those would get traded back to the colonies and also to Africa. And so, because tobacco, cotton, sugar are agricultural products, this unfortunately supported uh, the institution of slavery. Uh, so goods like tobacco and cotton, very labor intensive, and so though they're very valuable, they were a cash crop for these colonies. But in the colonists' view, they used slave labor to farm these goods. And so, unfortunately, tobacco, in addition to its harmful effects on individuals' health, also supported this industry. Um, Now, it took a long, long time for people to realize how harmful tobacco was. Native Americans had been using it for a long time, but Europeans had not. And it wasn't until really the late 1800s that its harmful effects on health were realized. Of course, the harmful effects of slavery were realized far before that. And so it's unfortunate that tobacco had this sort of dual harm to our society, both in terms of health and in supporting the institution of slavery. But again, these were economic products, and so tobacco was a very important economic force in early America. So opiates are another important economic component, one of the most interesting actually. So opiates, which we'll talk about again in a later unit, are derived from the opium poppy, which is just a plant. But again, it takes a certain skill set to harvest the opium from the plant. And opiates are analgesics, which is to say they're painkillers. And this was realized fairly early on in the Middle East, where the opium poppy grows naturally. But it's one of the most effective early medicines that was discovered, and it's consistently effective. Its pain-killing effects were realized fairly immediately, and also its negative consequences were realized fairly early as well. What this led to eventually was a really interesting portion of our history and the history of the world called the Opium Wars. And so the way that worked, what happened was that Britain primarily was growing opium in India. Of course, understood its value as a painkiller, but also the British knew that it was highly addictive. And so what they were doing was exporting it to a variety of places, but largely China. And so this is the East India Company, which is a British company. If you've seen the third Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the bad guys are the East India Company. So it's the same group of people. Um, Obviously, this is historically true, while Pirates of the Caribbean is not. Uh, but the East India Company wanted to get some goods that only China produced, things like silk, porcelain, tea, but they didn't really have anything that China needed. They didn't have anything to trade. And so what they did was they said, well, we've got all this opium. We'll start trading it to China. And of course, a lot of Chinese citizens got addicted to opium. And so they started trading for the goods that the British wanted. Well, the Chinese government realized this fairly quickly and eventually banned opium imports and made it illegal and actually punishable by death to be an opium smuggler. And so Britain, rather than losing its valuable commodity and its inlet into the Chinese economy, just went to war with China. Now, China wasn't as advanced technologically as Britain was. They weren't industrialized, so China lost. Um, by the way, France and even the U.S. chipped in on Britain's side because they had some small opium holdings as well, the U.S. mainly from Turkey. Uh, but the fact is that we all waged war on China so that China would open its borders and let us trade opium for their goods. Uh, Incidentally, the aftermath of this war is why Britain owned Hong Kong for so long. But this had a wide-ranging impact on history, not just in terms of owning Hong Kong for Britain, but also uh, our experience culturally with opium has influenced how we treat other drugs and drug users. Uh, Opium use was very widespread across the world, and its effects were very well understood. And so how we dealt with opium in our society really set the precedent for how we would deal with other drugs. And of course, beyond being used for religious, economic, and political uh, reasons, drugs now are first and foremost used as medicine. But historically, this was a difficult process because drugs are often discovered through trial and error. The scientific method didn't really start being applied until just a couple hundred years ago. And so traditional folk medicine was often based on trial and error, which plants were useful for what, which ones are dangerous. And so, of course, this process is error prone. If someone takes a plant and then gets sick, was it the plant or was it any of the other plants they consumed or foods they consumed? Or did they catch some disease? They didn't, ancient peoples didn't understand how diseases were spread either. And so it's hard to assess what good a drug is without a scientific framework. And so most early medicines were naturally occurring. They were plants um, that native peoples found and then put toward one illness or another, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. And again, part of the error-prone facet of this is that drugs would get applied to conditions where they weren't helpful, and of course, contexts where they were helpful would be missed if they weren't tried at that time. Now, of course, we have manufactured drugs, by which we mean industrially produced. But people have been manufacturing drugs in one way or another for a long time. So, for example, concentrating natural drugs, which is done with the opium poppy. It's done with alcohol. So again, things ferment naturally, but we develop technology as humans to process that fermentation, to increase it, and then to concentrate the product. And later on, once chemistry was developed as a discipline, we could modify naturally occurring drugs so that we could enhance the good properties, the helpful properties, and diminish the negative consequences. So things like heroin are modifications of naturally occurring opiates. And we'll talk about more about that in a couple of weeks. And again, many of these illicit drugs were originally used medicinally. It wasn't until later that they became illicit. And this ties into our point from last time about drugs having multiple effects. So drugs can have both positive and negative consequences. And more often than not, the positive consequences were realized, things like the ability of opium to diminish pain. And so that was realized before the negative consequences. That is, that it's easy to become dependent on opium. So for example, alcohol is traditionally used as a sedative and a relaxant and an anxiolytic, which just means an anxiety reducing agent. Uh, Drugs like cannabis, marijuana, reduce pains. They're analgesics. They're also antiemetics, which means they reduce nausea. They can prevent vomiting in illnesses where vomiting is a symptom. Cocaine, which we think of now as a fairly harmful and addictive drug originally, and it still is used as an anesthetic, and it's a good one. No less a person than Sigmund Freud, who we see here on the right, originally thought cocaine was a wonder drug, that it can cure things like depression. In fact, we don't think that anymore, but the fact is it's still useful as an anesthetic, but it has negative consequences, which led to its becoming illicit. But again, we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that a given drug is entirely good or entirely bad. We have to weigh the benefits against the consequences that are negative. Opium, again, is an analgesic. It's also an anti-diarrheal. So that doesn't seem like that big a deal now, but historically, many diseases like dysentery and cholera uh, produce intestinal have intestinal symptoms like diarrhea, and this is you're in big trouble if you lose all the fluid in your body that way. And so opium was used as an anti-diarrheal to maintain the presence of fluids in the body. In fact, just the other day I saw a commercial for a drug that's used to treat um, opium-related constipation, which is one of the things that opium does, or opiates. It's opioid-related constipation, and so people that take opioids regularly will eventually develop constipation the same way that opium was used as an anti-diarrheal historically. So now we have this negative consequence that is uh, constipation in opioid users that we have another drug to remedy. Now, usually it's the case positive qualities of a drug are found first, and the negative ones are discovered later on. But drugs like belladonna uh, originally were hallucinogenic. Now, it turns out belladonna is not a very pleasant hallucinogen, but they were used that way. And then eventually, belladonna became used as a cosmetic. It dilates the pupils of the eye, which makes the face more attractive. And so that was a property found later on. Perhaps more usefully, there are drugs like ibogaine. Ibogaine is a hallucinogen used in traditional religious ceremonies. But there's relatively new evidence just in the last 10 years or so that ibogaine may also be useful in treating drug addiction. That if someone is dependent on a drug, that ibogaine may be useful in getting them off of it. So again, this is something that was used for one particular purpose as a hallucinogen, but later on we discovered there may be medicinal properties that are useful. So let's go back and look at our current perspective. So in the United States, we have very clear laws that govern substance use, how available substances are, uh, and we have the capability to enforce those laws. We have governing bodies, we have law enforcement agencies. And of course, this is a relatively new phenomenon. Even as recently as a couple hundred years ago, societies often couldn't enforce drug laws throughout the entire nation. And in the US, we also have this distinction between legal and illegal drugs, and we manufacture a lot of pharmaceuticals, of legal drugs, which is not to say they're not controlled, but there are contexts in which they are available and prescribed. And the illicit drugs, the ones we view as harmful, are imported. We import. Now, again, not legally, but the countries from which these drugs come, to a certain degree, depend on them economically. These are economic products. And so it doesn't, again, we can look back to the Opium War to see a very distinct switch. Before, a couple hundred years ago, we were willing to wage a war so that we could export an addictive drug to a country, and now we are in fact the target of similar exports. So we have our war on drugs, when not long ago, we were the ones exporting an addictive substance. So this is our current perspective. We think of drugs, and illicit drugs in particular, as being something that comes from the outside. Now, granted, we have things like methamphetamine, which tend to be produced internally to the U.S., uh, but again, that's a relatively new attitude that drugs come from without and that they're an adversary we need to combat. Uh, and of course, our attitudes are still shifting. So we talk about entheogens, which traditional native peoples use in religious ceremonies, and there are recent laws that have allowed limited use of entheogens by certain Native American groups because it's part of their religious practice. And of course, here in Colorado, we're familiar with the fact that laws governing cannabis or marijuana are changing. And this is very recent as well. So we don't want to think of our attitudes toward drugs and drug use as being something static, and they don't exist in a vacuum, right? They have a historical context. And so it's important to keep in mind that our current attitude toward drugs and drug use has not been the prevailing attitude throughout history. Um, and it is not even pervasive around the world right now. Which is not to say that our attitude right now is right or wrong. Again, we're just looking at the differences and putting them in context so that we can evaluate these ideas critically. Okay, so that does it for our lecture on the history of drugs. Next week, we will begin our section on drugs and the brain. So we'll begin by looking at the brain without drugs, understanding neurons, which are brain cells, and the individual electrical impulses that neurons exhibit, which are action potentials, and how neurons talk to one another, which is what we call synaptic transmission, and how that transmission, the information being passed throughout the brain, is modified by drugs. So I will see you all next week, and that is it for lecture today.